Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on unlocking spatial carbon planning for local authorities. I'm Lewis Knight. I'm a director here at Bioregional, and I will be chairing today's session. This webinar is being recorded, and we will share a recording and the slides in due course afterwards. Next slide, please, Joe, if that's okay. So first of all, I wanted to start with a big question, which is, do we really know the carbon impact of approving our local plans? So with the clock ticking on net zero commitments, it's clear that local authorities have to balance their growth targets, sustainability, and infrastructure, all while navigating some level of policy uncertainty, housing, and also carbon reduction targets. This is a real high stakes challenge, and the tools currently available today don't always make it easy. So next slide, please, Joe, if that's okay. So in the next 45 minutes, we're going to explore this challenge. So we're going to explore why spatial carbon modelling is essential for planning decisions. We're going to explore a little bit about our solution, and that's hopefully why you're here today, about how our new Net-zero Spatial Carbon Tool enables smarter, evidence-based local planning. We're also really lucky to be able to explore some real-world impact. So how our tool is already helping local authorities, such as West Oxfordshire, but also a number of others that we've worked with previously and also through the creation of this tool. So first of all, I'm going to introduce our panel. So we're really lucky today to have Celia Davis, who is the Senior Projects and Policy Officer at the TCPA. She's going to set the scene on why we urgently need to integrate carbon into spatial planning. We'll then be joined by Joe Mortensen, who is an Associate Director here at Bioregional, and Ed Parham, a Director at Space Syntax. They're going to deep dive into the tool, how it works, and some of the background and data that sits behind it. Finally, we have Andrew Thompson, who is the Planning Policy Lead at West Oxfordshire District Council, who is going to share his local authority perspective and real-world application. But first of all, I'd really happy to turn to Celia from the TCPA, who is going to give a little bit of background about the challenge. Celia, over to you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Lewis, for that introduction. And being asked to define the challenge of climate change and why it's so important to the role of us as planners, I feel becomes easier year on year because we are all living and seeing the impacts of climate change more routinely in our daily lives. Each winter, which is wetter with more storms, and it's images on the news of communities desperately affected by flooding. The summers where we have these extreme peaks and troughs of heat that make life quite challenging for many people that live in towns and cities, set the context of why we really need to prioritise and centralise climate change in so many of the decisions that we are making. Now, the impacts of climate change we know are really spatially specific. So the East Coast communities that are facing sea level rise and increasingly accelerating coastal erosion, who are concerned about their long-term viability in the coming decades, will be facing different challenges to low-lying communities on estuaries compared to those in towns and cities dealing with the effects of extreme heat in our summer months. But it's not just the climate impacts that are spatially specific, it's also mitigation is really important to think of in spatial terms, because the locations that we choose and the way that we develop and build and design our communities can have lasting impacts on carbon emissions and lock in behaviours that may be carbon dependent for generations to come. So we know that as planners, we have to work under legislation and policy, and the planning legislation is linked to the Climate Change Act. So we have a legislative responsibility to make sure that planning is contributing to the national target of net zero by 2050. And this has really recently been emphasised in the updated National Planning Policy Framework, which references the 2050 date for the first time, which is really good news. We know that planning is really a central tool for meeting this challenge because it provides a regulatory framework for many of the really high emitting sectors that contribute to carbon emissions, including energy, transport and buildings. And we can use planning as a tool to manage not just the location, but also the design of those infrastructure assets. However, as Lewis implied, in practice, there are persistent gaps. Some work that we did with the Centre for Sustainable Energy in 2023 surveyed local planning authorities to ask questions about the carbon impacts of their local plans. And we couldn't find evidence that planning was routinely and proactively aligning with the net zero target that's set nationally. 1/3 of local authorities that we spoke to said that they thought their local plans were not at all aligned with national carbon reduction targets and the carbon budgets. 1/3 said they didn't know. So they were in the dark really about the carbon implications of the growth that they were planning in their local area. Only 12% of authorities that we spoke to could quantify the carbon impact of development. So those 12% of authorities, I think, really represent this emerging practice, which is coming from vanguard local authorities that are really setting the way for others to follow in terms of how carbon can be accounted for and how climate change can be more centralised in the way that local plans are developed. And I think there are some reasons why that's not kind of the common practice. And one of those is about policy direction at a national level. So I'm going to be uncharacteristically optimistic and point to some really important hooks that have come in the recent NPPF update. Firstly, as I mentioned, we have the reference to the 2050 target. We also have paragraph 163, which is really clear that climate mitigation and adaptation needs to apply to decisions and applications as well as plan making. There are really important hooks about transport and the prioritisation of a vision-led approach to transport, which is a progressive step, and local authorities can use this to really centralise sustainable and active travel. And MHCLG have also committed to developing planning practice guidance on carbon accounting. Now, the TCPA would love this to be mandatory part of the plan making process, but guidance for those that do want to look at carbon literate planning is a really important hook and a really welcome step. So, of course, there are still some policy frustrations at a national level, but I think the direction of travel and those hooks are really important. And from our experience and what we've seen, innovation is really being driven at a local level by authorities that are choosing to place carbon reduction and climate change as a central outcome of their local planning activity. And really, I think what this demonstrates is national policy trying to catch up with those local authorities. And I really hope that that is setting a path for other authorities to follow. Where local authorities have centralised carbon reduction, the evidence has been absolutely fundamental in supporting their approach. So carbon literate planning really is the way forward. I don't think that there is any way around that really. And that's why the TCPA really welcome this Net-zero Spatial Planning Tool as part of a toolkit that local authorities can use to help embed that practice more commonly. So I really look forward to hearing more about the tool this morning, and more importantly, really look forward to seeing its use in practice.
Thank you so much, Celia. I think what you mentioned there really underscores the urgency that we all face in shifting towards a level of evidence-based spatial planning and the pressures and challenges that local authorities face. Before I really quickly hand over to Joe and Ed, I just want to remind everybody that there is a Q&A function on the top ribbon that you can see. So if you do have any questions as we're going through, in anything that you hear, anything that you'd like to ask, please do put your question in, and we will have some time at the end of the webinar webinar where we can start to answer some of these questions. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Joe and also our project partner Ed Parham from Space Syntax. They're going to start to deep dive into the tool a little bit and crucially look at the transport modeling integration as well as the functionality of the tool, the user experience, and how we see the applications of the tool being used. So Joe, over to you.
Thanks, Lewis. Good morning, everyone. I'm just going to take you on a quick tour of how this tool was developed over time and talk a bit about the functionality and how Ed's team plugged into the new spatial carbon tool. As Celia just mentioned, one of those vanguard authorities that are really pushing on climate action embedded into local plans was Greater Cambridge, and we supported them a few years ago. And they really came to us with this challenge to develop a methodology and analysis in support of their local plan making to understand how the carbon implications sort of interacted with 3 stages of planning. So first, they wanted to understand the very early elements of the process to get to formulate general ideas of how to grow in the most carbon sensitive way. And then they ask us to go a little bit more granular so that they could play with the densities of specific locations. And then finally, the third level was to zoom into the site level analysis to describe the carbon impacts at specific locations and be able to do a comparative analysis between those sites. So we've done this, we've used this methodology for Greater Cambridge and also with Central Links and Forest of Dean, really honing in sort of what our data model looks like. And early outputs of the tool were very Excel based. They were very manual to run the model and to produce the scenarios. And the result was really effective and defensible, but it was also really time consuming for both our local authority partners and our teams who were conducting the analysis. So after we used it successfully with Greater Cambridge and other authorities, we were happy with the data and happy with the results, but we knew that there were a lot of improvements that would ease the process and also really minimize the risk of human error in all of these sort of spreadsheet elements. And after we started to learn about the Space Syntax Walkability Index, we started to talk about how we could really integrate a sophisticated transport data model into sort of layering up all of this data. So we decided to partner with them for an Innovate UK grant. And we ran that project all of last year to really create this dynamic tool that we're sharing with you now today. So we began our build by really dialing in the methodology and automating those database feeds that sort of underpin this whole model, and they give us the most robust outputs. And we've built a Power BI dashboard, which is part of the Microsoft suite, to make that really accessible to local authorities. And this Power BI model, we regularly update with these data sources. And this dashboard that we've produced gives control to you, the user, to test various policies, and you're able to immediately see those outcomes. And we're going to get into this in just a moment. And crucially, we have automated the transport model through this collaboration with Space Syntax. And now I'm going to just welcome Ed to tell you a bit more about how integral that transport model has become.
Thanks, Joe. So I'm going to talk through a bit about the model now, but the reason why we have done this is to address the question that Celia posed at the beginning, which was this issue about decisions made very early on in the planning process can effectively lock people into carbon dependent lifestyles. These stories on the screen now, they're probably familiar to everybody on the call. They come through at fairly regular intervals. People move into brand new houses. They find that they're essentially car dependent when they move in, that it's really difficult to move around in different ways. That's for a series of different reasons. And we know that this has really profound impacts, not just on the individual, but on wider society. And those outcomes include things like emissions, climate change, but also personal health and public health as well. And if we go on to the next slide, please, what we've done over the last 18 months or so is to produce a transport carbon model, and it takes characteristics of location and place, and this then explains how it affects the mode share from different parts of the country, the distances that people drive, and the emissions that result from it. And sorry, not just the distances that people drive, but the distances people take using all modes and for all purposes. Now, we've developed 4 separate models, which I'm going to explain a bit more about in a minute. And these models explain around 3/4 of the mode share across every LSOA. So LSOAs are the census boundary areas. They typically have a population of around about 3,000 people. So there's a huge number of LSOAs in the country. We've been working at that really fine granular scale. The model combines a series of different components. It combines socioeconomic factors with spatial and locational factors. And this means you can see not just the factors that influence behavior choice, but the factors that you have control over through planning. Now, the way that we've done that, we've taken hundreds of thousands of data points from lots and lots of different sources, and we've developed the model in 3 stages. The first stage was this piece, which was to take each LSOA and to categorize it according to its location. And this is really looking at, if we go on to the next slide, we're looking at how each LSOA is embedded within a wider region, but also within a larger settlement. And that gives us 4 different categories of LSOA, and they range from an LSOA that might be in the center of a big city in the middle of a big region, like in London, to an LSOA that might be in a small village in a very rural area. So the second stage of this was then for each of those categories of area, we took commuting mode share data from the census, and we've analysed that against a range of spatial and non-spatial factors. This was a big data science piece, as you can see from this. We looked at individual correlations between factors. We looked at the way that results were clustering. We looked at distributions within specific data sets. And then what we did was we started to combine multiple factors into multivariate models. So what we can then do is for each of those 4 categories of area, we have a mode share model, which can explain the number of journeys to work by car. We then scaled that using other data sets so that we can start to talk not just about the journeys to work by car, but journeys by all purposes and all modes. The third step was then to go back into the census data and to extract from every MSOA the actual distances that people were driving to work. And again, we can then scale that to all purposes and all modes, and then to link that data with DFT vehicle registration data. So what that then means is that we have 3 things. We have a mode share model that works for every LSOA in the country. We have a unique distance that people are traveling within those MSOAs, and using the vehicle registration data, we know the cars that are registered and the emissions that are produced for each one. So if we go on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So what we have is the core components of the model. What were found to be consistently significant across the whole country were about how each area was integrated within the wider region, the way it was integrated in a bigger settlement, the walkability of the local area. So that explains this combination of the way that the land use, the density, the street network all fit together, and they make certain land uses easier to get to and easier to walk to. Access to public transport, population, income, and household makeup. So that's things like household size and age and those kind of things. All of these data sets we have available for the whole country. What the tool does is it imports this, it's pre-processed. The tool imports the data for a specific area into a really nice, simple interface. And you can then use that tool to develop scenarios and to then test them. I'm going to hand back to Joe to explain a bit more about what the tool does and how it makes all of this analysis really accessible to people.
Amazing. Thanks, Ed. So the result of our work last year has given us the Net-zero Spatial Planning Tool, and it works on 3 different levels for you. So this sort of harkens back to the early days with Greater Cambridge. So at the highest level, you're going to see an output of a heat map of carbon intensity by the ONS output area. This gives you a sense of your area, of different areas in your region that for carbon emission reasons that you may want to avoid or focus on in terms of your growth scenarios. The next level offers us more granularity where you can begin to test your own packages of growth distribution, and you can also see the carbon impacts of how you're dialing up different areas of growth. And finally, on the most granular level, the tool allows you to look at specific sites to predict carbon emissions that result from development on those sites, and that gives you that ability to do comparative analysis with other sites as well. So before getting into the dashboard, I just wanted to show you how easy we've made it for you to get your local data loaded into the tool itself. So we provide these easy to populate forms that you save up to your private SharePoint folder. And then this allows you to create growth scenarios that test various locations and densities with virtually no bounds for your optioneering. So you can just sort of put new scenarios in, upload them to the tool, hit refresh, and you can sort of see those impacts being modeled live right in front of your eyes. So the next step would be, after you get your data loaded, is you go to this page that allows you to set different policy variables. So this, you can test sort of how ambitious you would like to be with your local planning policies. You can stress test different policy implications to identify the carbon impacts of different policy pathways. And these variables on the screen, they're quite small, but basically they deal with your pace of growth, the pace of electrification of transport in your area, and your policy ambitions around both embodied and operational carbon. So now getting into our outputs, the first output that I mentioned is a heat map. So this can help with those early planning discussions and help you prioritize areas for further study and to sort of dive into that analysis for yourself. But it gives you a really nice sort of first look at what your area looks like and where the most and least carbon intensive places would be to place development. The next outputs for sort of the next two levels of analysis, they visualize the impact of your growth scenarios. So you can model various configurations of growth. So for each of those output areas, you can dial up and down the number of homes, and you're able to see where your carbon originates. As I said earlier, the operational, the embodied, and the transport emissions are all visualized and broken out for you, so you can see sort of what the impacts are of those decisions. And then in this, in sort of the lower right-hand corner of the screen, you can also see the pathway of how your carbon targets will or will not be met over a multi-decade period. So it really gives you a sense of how your plans are fitting into your local commitments in terms of carbon reduction as well. So this next slide here is just a visualization of our interface. This is actual screenshots from the tool itself. This singular tool gives you a variety of different visualizations that can be used for lots of different audiences. That's something that we heard loud and clear from our partner local authorities that helped us develop this tool through the Innovate process, was that they have lots of different audiences to communicate with over time, over sort of the local plan process. And so it was really important that we were able to give a variety of different graphics that work for different audiences. You can also export your data into spreadsheets so that you can insert them into your own reports or create your bespoke graphics if you have that capacity within your teams. So just to round up my side of this and hand this back to Lewis, just to underscore that the spatial tool has been enhanced to support local planning authorities to tackle complex carbon modeling and make it simple and make it a really smooth user experience for you. We're really excited to introduce this tool, and it gives you a really powerful new way to understand the carbon impacts associated with your local plan. We've got this interactive mapping element that helps you visualize your growth scenarios. We have this scenario comparison element that helps you look at multiple growth and development scenarios simultaneously and sort of size them up against one another so that you can identify the most sustainable approaches for your area. And we've also got this detailed emissions analysis that helps you drill down into your emission breakdowns by category and over time. So now I'm going to hand this back to Lewis, who I think is going to bring in Andrew, who is one of our local authority partners.
Thank you so much, Joe and Ed. Yeah, it's fantastic to get a little glimpse into the tool. We're just, I'm very conscious we're just showing you some of the kind of visuals and sort of screenshots and just trying to explain where we think the value and the applicability of the tool. And it's fantastic. There's so many questions coming in, so we'll try and answer these as many as we can now live, but also at the end. We've got about 10 minutes for Q&A. I did just want to also just say please do get in touch with us afterwards. You will see a web link and a QR code. You can book a live demo with us where we can sort of really kind of drill into the tool in a lot more detail. So just want to give you that as well. So I'm now going to hand over to Andrew Thompson, who is the Planning Policy Manager from West Oxfordshire District Council, who has been one of our project partners in the development of this tool. So tools are only really useful if they work in practice. So Andrew has first-hand experience of helping develop and sort of guide the tool. So Andrew, over to you, who can give us a little bit more insight. Thank you.
Thank you, Lewis, and thank you for inviting me today to give our local authority perspective. My name's Andrew Thompson, and I'm the Planning Policy Manager at West Oxfordshire District Council. We're currently in the process of developing a new local plan for the district, which will guide development in the district through to 2041. In 2019, our council declared a climate and ecological emergency, and this had a significant influence on our planning approach. Ensuring compliance with the National Planning Policy Framework, we are placing measures to address the causes and mitigate the impacts of climate change at the heart of our local plan. The updated local plan will be crucial in supporting our transition to net zero by 2050, covering, as it will, the next 15-year period leading up to the target date. In our efforts to address the causes of climate change and reduce carbon emissions, the plan-making process will involve decisions about the spatial distribution of development, as well as the design and construction standards for new buildings and the delivery of transport and energy infrastructure. A robust evidence base is essential for developing a sound plan, along with testing of reasonable alternatives for levels of growth, spatial distribution of development, and strategic growth locations. For previous plans, testing of options through the plan-making process might have lacked detail regarding the carbon impacts of different spatial options, with us reaching high-level conclusions about the climate impacts in accordance with the Sustainability Appraisal Framework. Whilst the Sustainability Framework is important for testing alternatives and drawing high-level conclusions about the impacts of development, we believe that more detailed testing of the carbon impacts is needed to inform the plan and to support our transition to net zero. West Oxfordshire, like everywhere else, faces significant pressure to accommodate new development, with housing targets set to increase dramatically. This presents a challenge as we seek to balance growth with our net zero ambitions. To better understand how different spatial options and policy decisions could impact carbon emissions, we have explored the use of the bioregional tool. The tools that they have developed offer a valuable opportunity to quantify the carbon impacts of development options and to test the implications of decarbonising development and the transport network in our districts. The tool allows us to test different scales, locations and types of development, including urban, fringe and rural development typologies, to inform the appraisal of the plan. Being able to quantify carbon impacts more accurately helps us draw stronger conclusions about environmental outcomes of plan options and define preferred options for further testing through the plan-making process. In practice, scoring climate impacts could be based on factors like the proximity of sites to transport networks and key services. The bioregional tool enabled us to assess the carbon impacts more effectively and generate clear, accessible outputs to inform the plan-making process. While climate change is just one criteria in the optioneering process, if we are truly to place it at the heart of the plan, it's important to understand the variation in carbon emissions from different spatial options. This helps us determine what additional measures and interventions are needed to achieve net zero carbon development. We believe that the reports generated by tools like bioregional will form a vital part of the evidence base supporting the local plan. Carbon assessment tools can play an important role in plan making, supporting policymakers develop plans and policies to achieve net zero carbon ambitions. These tools help more accurately quantify the carbon emissions associated with different activities in the development process, allowing us to evaluate various strategies and highlight the carbon impacts of different development choices. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for that. It's always great to have one of our partners that we've worked with, particularly a local authority, sort of giving their insight into the development and use of the tool. So, Joe, if I can just go to the next slide, if that's okay. So we're almost at the end of the webinar, and I do want to give a good amount of time for some questions and answers, but just to say there are lots of questions. So what we'll do is we will take these questions and we will kind of formally answer them, and we will send that out with a recording of the webinar and also the slides. But just to reiterate, in a couple of slides time, there will be a link that you can sign up. You can go to the web page and you can book a demo with us. So to summarize, what do we think is unique about our tool, and what does this mean in practice, and why is it so valuable? So we think that it's really user friendly. We hope it's really cost effective, and it seamlessly integrates with Microsoft software. So it uses Power BI as its base. And that was a crucial part of the development of the tool, was to ensure that anyone with Microsoft Suite could have access to it. We think it's really efficient. It provides real-time modeling, integration of GIS, and the ability to scenario test different growth and site selections and options. It's evidence and experience based, so it uses that robust data that Ed and Joe mentioned, and carbon impact assessments to actually guide decisions. Next slide, please, Joe. So what does this mean in practice? So with our tool, we hope local planning authorities can compare those different growth options and scenarios. They can test sites, but also crucially, different policy approaches and options, both for operational carbon, but also embodied carbon. And you can test that for policies that you have now, but also policies that you might have in 5 years' time under a new planning regime. It can quantify the carbon impact, so it covers embodied, operational and transport emissions, all integrated into one model. This will allow, we hope, local authorities to make data-driven decisions that will align their local plans with both local and national net zero targets, so touching really strongly on what Celia was mentioning at the start. We hope it will improve public and stakeholder engagement. It will use clear and visual outputs to communicate the carbon impacts effectively, and crucially enables local authorities to visualize the results, so turning complex data and carbon decisions into what we hope are intuitive graphics. So next slide, please, Joe. So just before we get to the Q&A, we've got just over 10 minutes left on that. If today's discussion has sparked any ideas for you, for your local area, for your local authority, we would love to hear from you, and we'd love to chat to you. So you can book a demo and you can see the tool in action with a member of our team. There's a QR code there that you can scan, but also the hyperlink just underneath the QR code there will take you directly to the web page. So now, as we move into our Q&A, I would encourage you to continue to drop questions into the chat. We'll answer as many as we can now. So I'm just looking there now. I'm just looking at a question from Harry, which says, would the tool be able to model low energy housing standards, for example, a development that is to passive house standards? So I'll take that one. Harry, just to respond directly, yes, it can. You have a variables tab that you can choose different standards of operational and embodied carbon. So one of those selections is developments that will be built to a passive house standard. So it allows you that ability to test what would be the carbon impact under current building regs or future home standard developments, and those that are built to a passive house standard. So I'm just responding to that one. Just looking now, which maybe is for you, Ed, which is, does the tool distinguish between urban and rural locations? So in an urban location, the conclusion of said mapping could be, rather than avoiding development, these are areas where transport links and community facilities such as health and education should be improved to facilitate growth and housing. So does it distinguish between those two?
Yes, it distinguishes between locations because we've taken basically everywhere in the country and categorized it according to those things. One of the elements that has gone into the model is the walkability index. The walkability index includes access to a whole range of different land uses. So that would include all of those things that you were mentioning, Lewis. So it will be able to start to tell you where you've got, in some ways, capacity to support things. So sorry, that's not a very clear way of answering that. Maybe one of the ways of saying it is that one of the things that this type of modelling can show you is the places where there are mismatches. And by that, I mean that there is the opportunity to have fewer people driving, more people walking, more people cycling, compared to the actual numbers that do. You could also potentially see that there might be mismatches between those facilities and the numbers of people who are living in those areas. So again, you can see where there's capacity to grow things without necessarily having to physically extend somewhere. It might be about regeneration or infill or some kind of redevelopment.
That's great, Ed. I'm just gonna stay with you if that's okay. Which is there's quite a few questions about the sort of data sources. There's a really good question from Heidi, which says, "Have the impacts of the COVID pandemic on census data been considered? How easy is it to update the model following major changes, such as, for example, a new highway scheme completion or perhaps a new railway line?" There's quite a few questions about data, so maybe as well as answering that directly, maybe also just spend another minute just talking about those data sources as well.
Yeah, so on the data sources, we have so what has gone into it is census data, a number of space syntax data sets. So that includes spatial network models of the whole of the UK. It includes our integrated urban model, which is where the walkability index comes from. We've extracted different things from different censuses, basically. So we've looked at things like the distances that people travel have been extracted from census data. There is DFT data, which is published on a regular basis, which starts to tell you things about the number of vehicle registrations and how they relate on an area by area basis into different categories of emission. One of the things to deal with this question of what happens if there's a major highway or something, what we have pre-processed for the whole country is the existing situation. So that means that we can just extract that data, put it into the tool really quickly, and it's ready to go. What we can do, it takes a little bit longer, is to look at future scenarios or scenarios that might not be reflected in the existing conditions. So we can then take our models, we can add in new connections, we can reprocess them, add them into the models and push them back into the tool. So it's possible to do that. Some of those scenarios, it depends on how significant the level of intervention is. They might be easier or quicker to update and process than others. And sorry, linking back also the question, there was a part of this was about COVID, wasn't it? And working from home. And there was, when we were looking at this, when we developed the model, we used the 2010 and 2011 census as a starting point. We know that the census that was carried out during COVID, it asked people to report not where they normally worked outside of COVID, but to say if they were working from home or not. What we also looked at the same time as that was, I think in the National Travel Survey, they produced fairly regular updates that were talking about the proportions of people who were working from home at different times. You could start to see how that changed during COVID and how quickly it was recovering or returning closer to what it was like before. So we have taken account of those things. I think the really interesting bit that I found from that was that actually, even at the peak of COVID, there were fewer people working from home than I expected. And it started to reduce closer to where it was before relatively quickly, although there is still obviously lots of people still work from home or work in this hybrid way.
Thanks, Ed. There's quite a few questions I've just been scanning about about sort of the ability to look at other facets of spatial growth. And so just to say, as the tool is named, it really just focuses on carbon. It doesn't touch on other things around sort of land use, around climate adaptation, around flood risk. That is something that maybe a next iteration of the tool. We've just been really focused on what is the carbon impact of different growth options, really understanding the fact that that doesn't really enter the psyche of when we're sort of allocating sites. So that's been our primary focus. It's absolutely right to mention in the comments, should we be looking at these other things? Yes, we should. Just at this point in time, we're just focusing on the kind of carbon associated with that growth. There was a good question also just at the top from someone called Anthony, which was talking about that it's just looking at emissions associated with growth and it doesn't look at the sort of per capita emissions for scenarios, but crucially what our tool does, we feel, is it starts to give confidence and evidence behind why certain growth scenarios might be chosen or might be more preferable than others, and it provides that sort of data behind that decision. There's quite a few questions about the sort of remit of the tool in terms of is it far more local plan focused? Can it be used on specific sites? Could it be used for a neighbourhood plan? I'm going to answer that now, but also Joe, I wondered if you wanted to come in. My general response here is that the power of the tool is very much at that local plan level. It's very much about we feel taking local authorities on that journey, sort of starting with that heat map, so understanding where are the potential lower carbon locations within an area, and then being able to give that granularity to test different growth options, and then to get even more granular to look at specific sites associated with those different growth options. So it does that really well. It can, of course, specifically, you can just specifically enter one site and it would give you the carbon associated with that. So the answer to that is yes, it can be used on a site, on a single site, but the power of it is when you're assessing entire sort of growth scenarios. Joe, I didn't know if I answered that correctly or if you wanted to add anything to that.
No, you absolutely answered that correctly. And I was just going to say the comments coming through are just they're almost tracking sort of what the team's ideas were as we were developing. So we knew we needed to stay really focused on answering that exam question that had been set about, the carbon implications of growth and growth scenarios. And we were able to get down to these, the site-by-site analysis level. But then we started to think about, the impacts to biodiversity and flooding and resilience generally. And so I think we sort of started to take notes for like further iterations of the tool. So stay tuned, because there's a lot more innovation that can happen out of this as well. But we feel like we have a really wonderful sort of foundational package with all of these robust data sources coming together to create a really powerful output, and it's a wonderful place to start. So if you have other comments about, where we should innovate next and what types of other data plugins would be really useful for you to see all in one tool, then we'll definitely take that on board as we continue to iterate and develop the tool.
Thank you, Joe. We are now at time. There were loads more questions, literally almost hundreds. There's a really good question that has just popped up on my screen, which is from Sean, which is around the National Land Use Framework and ensuring the data is incorporated. The answer is we haven't been approached directly, but that's a very live conversation that we're having internally about that. There were also questions about it being used to assess the impact of big infrastructure projects such as East West Rail. The short answer is no. It doesn't sort of directly assess infrastructure to the project. It's very focused on sort of housing and the sort of associated non-residential development that goes alongside that. We could continue to answer these questions probably for the next hour, but I'm conscious of people's time. So I'm going to draw us to a close. So if I could just go to the final slide, if that's okay, Joe. So thank you all for joining us today. It's been wonderful to have so many of you with us. And just a reminder, if you would like to find out more, if you would like a demo, you'd like to explore the tool in more detail, you've got the QR code and the hyperlink underneath, and we'd love to explore how we can support you. So finally, from me, Lewis, just a huge thank you to our panel, Celia, Joe, Ed, and Andrew, and to all of you for joining us today. So have a lovely rest of the day. Thank you all.